3D imaging technicians scanned 2 mummies and took over 50,000 images.
Scientists are releasing new video showing X-rays of the alleged alien remains.
Researchers believe they've located the leading cause of death when it comes to mummies.
Scientists finally tested a 7,000-year-old mummy's DNA. And what they found wasn't just surprising, it was history-shattering. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of the Sahara Desert. No rivers, no trees, no signs of life. Just endless waves of sand stretching to the horizon under a burning sun. It feels like the last place on Earth where you'd expect to uncover a secret about the origin of humanity. But buried deep within a rocky shelter in the Libyan desert, hidden for 7,000 years, were the remains of 2 women, naturally preserved, silent, forgotten by time. For decades, scientists believed they had a solid understanding of North Africa's ancient past, who lived there, where they came from, how populations moved and mixed. The timeline seemed clear. Then geneticists extracted DNA from these mummies. What came back from the lab stunned even the experts. One leading archaeogeneticist reportedly said that if he had been told the genomes were 40,000 years old, he would have believed it. Think about that. These women weren't who anyone expected them to be. Their DNA pointed to a hidden chapter of human history, a mysterious population long suspected but never directly identified, a lineage that may have survived in isolation while the rest of the world changed around them. So, who were they? How did they survive in a region that is now one of the harshest places on Earth? And why does their genetic code force scientists to rethink 50,000 years of human migration? Before we uncover what scientists actually found, hit like and subscribe, because stories like this don't just change history, they change how we see ourselves. This isn't just an archaeological discovery, it's a rewrite of our origins. Let's start at the beginning. A world hidden beneath the sand. The place at the center of all this is called the Takarakori rock shelter. It sits in the far southwest corner of Libya, in a landscape that today looks like the end of the world. Endless dunes, barren rock, extreme heat, and silence. To even reach it, you need a 4-wheel drive vehicle and a serious amount of determination. But here's the thing. 7,000 years ago, this place looked absolutely nothing like that. Between roughly 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, the entire Sahara Desert went through something scientists call the African humid period. And it was nothing short of a miracle of climate. The world's largest hot desert transformed into one of its most fertile landscapes. There were permanent lakes and flowing rivers. There were elephants and hippopotamuses. There were fish, grasslands, trees, and wildlife stretching as far as the eye could see. It was, in every sense, a green Sahara, a Mediterranean Serengeti, right in the heart of what is now the most desolate place on Earth. And in a small rock shelter in what is now Libya, a community of people had been living, farming, herding animals, and building a life for thousands of years, completely unknown to modern science, until the excavation of Takarakori began in 2003. The day they found the first mummy. The dig was led by Professor Savino Dernier, an associate professor of African archaeology and ethnoarchaeology at Sapienza University of Rome. And on just the second day of excavation, something extraordinary turned up. We scratched the sand, Dernier recalled, and found the mandible, a jawbone, and attached to it, preserved tissue, preserved skin, a human being, naturally mummified by the extreme dryness of the desert air, and sitting undisturbed in that rock for 7,000 years. In total, the team uncovered the remains of 15 individuals, 13 women and children, and 2 of them had mummified so completely that their skin, ligaments, and soft tissue were still intact across 7 millennia. That almost never happens in hot environments. The heat, the temperature swings between day and night. These conditions shatter biological material at the molecular level. But somehow, against all odds, these 2 women had survived time itself. "We started with these 2 because they are very well preserved," Dernier said. "The skin, ligaments, tissues." The site also contained evidence that this wasn't a one-time camp. People had been living here, returning here, building a life here for more than 8,000 years. These were not wandering nomads passing through. These were people with roots, with community, with culture, a civilization hidden in the green Sahara that the rest of the world had forgotten. The small miracle of ancient DNA. Here's where things get technically remarkable, and I want you to appreciate just how difficult what these scientists achieved actually was. Extracting usable DNA from ancient mummies found in a hot desert environment is, in the words of the researchers themselves, almost impossible. Heat destroys genetic material. The brutal temperature swings of the Sahara, searing during the day, cold at night, break DNA apart at the molecular level. Every single previous attempt to recover whole genome sequences from North African archaeological sites in similar conditions had failed. Every one. This was the first time in scientific history that researchers managed to sequence complete genomes from human remains found in such a hot and arid environment. Johannes Krauss, the senior author of the study and director at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, described it as a small miracle. The team, led by archaeogeneticist Nata Salem, extracted DNA from the densest structures in the human body, the teeth and the leg bones, where genetic material holds on the longest. From there, they built complete genome sequences for both women. Then came the comparison. The team measured these 2 genomes against 795 present-day genomes and 117 ancient genomes from across Africa, Southwestern Asia, and Europe. That's a dataset of nearly 1,000 genetic profiles spanning the ancient and modern world, all designed to answer one question: where did these women come from? The answer shocked everyone in the room. Zero connection to sub-Saharan Africa. Before the results came back, the assumption was fairly straightforward. The Takarakori women lived in North Africa. The Sahara during their lifetime was green and crossable. So logically, their DNA should reflect a mixing of populations, some North African ancestry, some genetic connection to the sub-Saharan African groups just south of them. That's what basic geography and climate logic would predict. The results said no, absolutely not, zero. The Takarakori mummies carried no sub-Saharan African ancestry whatsoever. Despite living in the middle of a green, traversable Sahara, a continuous landscape that by all logic should have been a highway connecting North and sub-Saharan Africa through trade, migration, and interbreeding. These 2 women showed not a single genetic trace of any such interaction. Their DNA belonged to a population that had remained completely isolated from sub-Saharan African groups for tens of thousands of years. Isolated not in a barren wasteland, but in what appeared to be the most connected, open, fertile period of the Sahara's entire existence. Think about how strange that is. The doors were wide open. The landscape invited mixing. And yet somehow, this population had kept itself genetically sealed, invisible to the surrounding world, for an almost unimaginable length of time. But when researchers pushed further, looking for any ancient group these women were related to, the answer got even more startling. The ghost population, a lineage that shouldn't exist. The closest genetic relatives of the Takarakori women were not found anywhere near Libya. They were found in a cave in Morocco, specifically a site called Tafarout Cave, where 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers were buried. A population that predated the African humid period entirely. A group that lived in a completely different region. And yet genetically, these two sets of people were cut from the same ancient cloth. Both the Takarakori mummies and the Tafarout hunter-gatherers shared a deep genetic signature found nowhere else on Earth. A North African lineage completely unrelated to sub-Saharan African populations. A lineage that had apparently been living quietly along the northern edge of the African continent for tens of thousands of years, invisible to science, largely undiscovered until this moment. Scientists had actually suspected this population existed for some time. In the DNA of living North Africans today, there are faint genetic echoes, traces of something ancient, something that didn't fit neatly into any known lineage. These echoes were so subtle that researchers gave the suspected group a haunting name before they'd ever found a physical body. They called it a ghost population, a human group whose existence was only ever suggested by faint shadows in living people's DNA, but whose actual remains had never been found, until the sand of Takarakori gave up its dead. Our research challenges previous assumptions about North African population history, said Nata Salem, and highlights the existence of a deeply rooted and long isolated genetic lineage, linked to the very first humans to leave Africa. But the researchers didn't stop there. They went even further back, comparing the Takarakori genomes against one of the oldest known populations of Homo sapiens ever found outside of Africa. These were 50,000-year-old individuals from a site called Zlatý Kůň in the Czech Republic. They represent the very first wave of modern humans to walk out of Africa, the original pioneers of human expansion across the globe. And here's what the data showed. The Takarakori women were more closely related to these 50,000-year-old people from the Czech Republic than they were to any sub-Saharan African population, alive or ancient. Let that sink in for a moment. Two women who died in a Libyan desert 7,000 years ago were genetically more similar to 50,000-year-old pioneers from Central Europe than to anyone living just south of the Sahara. What this tells us is deeply profound. The ancestors of these women were either part of, or closely connected to, that very first wave of modern humans who left Africa at the dawn of our species' global journey. And then somehow they came back to Africa, or they were left behind as the rest of the wave pushed forward into Asia and Europe, and then they stayed. For 50,000 years, they stayed genetically unchanged. 50,000 years frozen in time. 50,000 years. That's the number we need to sit with for a moment, because it's almost incomprehensible. While this population sat quietly in North Africa, the rest of humanity spread across every continent on Earth. Thousands of languages were born and died. Empires rose in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Mesoamerica. Ice ages came and went. Sea levels rose and fell. The world transformed beyond recognition, over and over again. And through all of it, this population remained genetically frozen, unmixed, untouched, a branch of the human family tree that simply never merged with another branch for 50,000 years. Harold Ringbauer, researcher and group leader of archaeogenetics at the Max Planck Institute, called this extraordinary. Compared with Europe, where populations mix so constantly and thoroughly that no comparable genetic continuity exists over anything like that time scale, the Takarakori lineage stands alone. The whole genome carries the DNA for many of your ancestors, Ringbauer explained. As you go along the genome, you start seeing the different trees of your ancestors. One genome carries the stories of many. The stories in these two women's genomes span 50 millennia. That is not just rare. That has no parallel in the entire archaeological record. Civilization without migration. Now here's the second massive revelation, and this one hits at the very heart of how we think civilization spreads. The Takarakori women were not primitive cave dwellers. They were pastoralists, farmers, herders. They kept sheep, goats, and cattle. They made pottery. They built a functioning agricultural community right there in the Green Sahara, at a time when farming and animal domestication were the cutting-edge technologies of the ancient world. For decades, the scientific consensus has been that this kind of agricultural knowledge spread the way most things spread in the ancient world, through people, specifically through Near Eastern farmers from the region we now call Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Syria, physically migrating outward, carrying their animals and practices with them, interbreeding with local populations, and gradually spreading agriculture like a wave across the ancient world. The DNA of the Takarakori women destroyed that model completely. Their genomes contain no Near Eastern ancestry, no Levantine genetic signatures, no DNA from European farming populations. Nothing, not a single genetic fingerprint. That would suggest any of the population movements that the conventional theory required. And yet they were clearly farming. They were clearly herding. They had clearly mastered an agricultural way of life. We know now that they were isolated in terms of genetics, but not in cultural terms, Dernier explained. There are a lot of networks that we can identify from several parts of the continent, because we have pottery coming from sub-Saharan Africa, we have pottery coming from the Nile Valley, and the like. These people were trading. They were talking to their neighbors. They were watching, learning, and absorbing ideas and technologies from the civilizations all around them. But they were not interbreeding with those neighbors. Knowledge crossed their borders. People did not. Their tools, pottery, and even herding methods were adopted from outsiders, said Johannes Krauss, but there was little intermarriage. They're like living fossils, clinging to their ancestral roots. This is enormous. It means civilization, the real practical knowledge of how to farm, how to herd, how to make tools and pottery, can spread entirely through cultural contact without a single migrant crossing a single border. The old model of ancient history, where ideas travel on the backs of people, has to be fundamentally reconsidered. A Neanderthal story, frozen in time. If two major revelations weren't enough, buried deep in the genome data was a third discovery, one that changes what we know about when and how our ancestors first encountered Neanderthals. The Takarakori mummies carried Neanderthal DNA. Approximately 0.15% of their total genome came from Neanderthal ancestry. Now, that might sound like a tiny amount, and it is, but the context is everything. Most modern humans whose ancestors lived outside of Africa carry between 1.5 and 2% Neanderthal DNA in their cells today. That's the result of multiple rounds of interbreeding between our ancestors and Neanderthals as humans spread through Europe and Asia over tens of thousands of years. The Takarakori women had roughly 1/10 of that amount, more than most sub-Saharan Africans who have almost none, but far less than any Eurasian population. And that fraction tells a very specific story about timing. Their ancestors encountered Neanderthals, or people who had recently mixed with Neanderthals, during that very first wave of human migration out of Africa, around 50,000 years ago. The same migration connected to those Zlatý Kun individuals in the Czech Republic. They picked up that small trace of Neanderthal DNA during the earliest, most tentative contact between our species and theirs. But then they came back to Africa, or split off into North Africa, and their isolation began. They never experienced the deeper, later rounds of Neanderthal interbreeding that happened as humans pushed further into Europe and Asia. So that original 0.15%, that faint first contact trace, was all they ever carried, and they carried it, unchanged, for 50,000 years. The Takarakori lineage may represent the closest thing we have to a living genetic record of the very first moment modern humans and Neanderthals met. How the Sahara erased a ghost population. So what happened to these people? How does a civilization that survived for 50,000 years in genetic isolation simply disappear? The answer isn't war, it isn't plague, it isn't conquest. It is something far more powerful and far more familiar. Climate change. Around 5,000 years ago, the African humid period ended. The rains retreated. The lakes began to dry. The grasslands that had sustained this ghost population through ice ages and millennia of human history slowly turned to sand. The green Sahara became the desert we know today. And it didn't stop. It kept expanding, dune by dune, year by year, erasing the world these people had built. As their ecosystem collapsed around them, the carefully maintained cultural and genetic boundaries that had defined the Takarakori people for 50,000 years became impossible to sustain. The watering holes that had once been meeting places for trade became survival necessities shared with outsiders. The distances that had once separated them from neighboring populations shrank as resources grew scarcer. And so, for the first time in 50 millennia, the ghost population began to merge. Slowly, generation by generation, they were absorbed into the broader North African populations they had traded with for thousands of years, but never truly joined. They didn't vanish overnight. They dissolved, leaving behind only faint genetic traces in the DNA of modern North Africans, and two naturally mummified women in a Libyan rock shelter, waiting 7,000 years for someone to find them. What lies beneath the sand? Louise Humphrey, a research leader at the Natural History Museum's Centre for Human Evolution Research in London, someone who had no involvement in this study, confirmed just how significant these findings are. DNA extracted from two pastoralist women who were buried at the rock shelter around 7,000 years ago reveals that most of their ancestry can be traced to a previously unknown ancient North African genetic lineage, she said. Future research integrating archaeological and genomic evidence is likely to yield further insights into human migrations and cultural change in this region. That word, unknown, is the one that matters. Before Takarakori, this lineage didn't exist in our understanding of human history. It was a ghost, and now it's real. And here's the thing that keeps researchers up at night. The Sahara Desert covers an area roughly the size of the United States. Beneath its dunes and inside its rock shelters, scattered across Libya, Algeria, Chad, and Niger, there may be dozens more naturally mummified populations from the Green Sahara era, each one carrying genetic data that could reveal entirely new branches of the human family tree. Each one a potential ghost population waiting to be named. These two women, these two shepherdesses who herded goats across a green Saharan savanna 7,000 years ago, and who lay forgotten in a crack in the rock until 2003, have done something extraordinary. They proved that a branch of humanity can exist for 50,000 years in genetic isolation while freely borrowing the knowledge of the world around it. They proved that civilization doesn't need migration to spread. They proved that the human story is far older, far stranger, and far more complex than we ever imagined. And they may be just the beginning. Because as DNA sequencing technology grows more powerful, and as desert archaeology pushes deeper into the great emptiness of the Sahara, the ghost population of Takarakori may prove to be only the first of many lost lineages hiding beneath the sand, each one waiting to rewrite the story of who we are and how we came to be. When the next mummy is found and its genome is sequenced, the history of the human race may have to be rewritten all over again.